plume expanding, or do you have
You know, there's different thoughts on that. The technical people say we don't have the data that says that the plume is expanding. We think that it's sitting there and the concentrations are going up. The stuff that's in the Vado zone is still leaking into the plume, and we're seeing concentrations go up. Others that think that maybe the water flows quickly underground kind of see it as maybe the plume is moving, but the hydrologists tell me, am I right, Danny, that there's no real data to support that it's moving as much as it is increasing.
Yeah, maybe just to add a little bit to that, part of the uncertainty is really that it takes a longer period of record, maybe, to really have enough information. These wells, some of the wells within the plume have very big concentrations, sometimes by double, and then come back down again. So it might have looked at one point that, you know, a well, one of the examples is the well up in the, just outside of the plume in the northeast corner. Had a period where it was climbing, and then it dropped back down to levels just as it had been. So a lot of the variability, it's unclear whether that's just variability in the plume or whether it's evidence of footprint expansion. So it's really unknown.
Have you recorded any chromium in like wells 45, 44?
I think we have detections in all of those wells that are up there. Again, one thing that made us want to move bias for action is these three wells here along our neighbor's border with San Ildefonso. We saw either an increase or a variation in that chromium concentration level, and again, that's why we went to the state and said, let's look at accelerating a corrective measure evaluation or looking at additional studies that'll get us there, as well as what you're going to see as part of our interim measure. We want to do chromium removal as well and see what influence that has. I shouldn't be this lost, but I am, because these do not match those. Might be back on. So this one I think is close enough. We monitor this plume quarterly with 20 wells, and we have sentinel wells that are protecting our drinking water wells, production wells at Los Alamos. These sentinel wells sit out in front of the drinking water wells, and if the plume is moving, the sentinel well would detect that contamination before there was any opportunity for the contaminant to get in the drinking water supply wells. So we monitor those as well. Again, we see concentrations ranging from 1,000 parts per billion and then down to just less of 50 parts per billion in these perimeter wells down here. And again, the concentrations we're seeing at the three wells I was talking about range from about 100 to 20 parts per billion. So the water supply wells and the sentinel monitoring wells show chrome, but we see the chrome in those wells closely related, if not exact, to what background levels are in the area. So we feel that we have the plume defined and it's outside the area of the drinking water supply wells. So this one kind of ties to an earlier slide. We submitted a phase 2 investigation report in in 2012. We have not got NMED comment back on that yet. That talked about nature and extent, fate, and transport, and that we thought we had enough information at the time to move forward with a corrective measure investigation, and the data that we had gathered would help support remedy selection. This actually sets up a remediation path, that report, and this is when we went to the state and asked if we could submit do an intermeasure, or do something to accelerate the process. And then that work plan with some back and forth with the state was submitted the end of April. Let's talk about the objectives of the intermeasures that we've proposed to the state. So we feel that we have the plume bound well enough that we would like to work with the state and move forward and identify an accelerated path for remedy. Within our intermeasures work plan, we've proposed pumping 2 of our existing wells in the area as much as those wells will allow, because they're a smaller diameter well. They were monitoring wells, but we're converting them to pumping wells, and we're going to pump those at a maximum sustainable volume for a few months till our plan is approved. We hope to get going in June and complete the pumping somewhere around November. From that, we can gain some additional knowledge that if we went full scale pump and treat, where we would place those wells. The pilot studies that we're doing, or the small scale pump and treat that we're doing this summer, will only generate about 3 million gallons of water. If we go full scale, we'll probably be generating and treating about 50 million gallons of water. So we'll have to work with the state engineer's office to decide how we're going to disposition that water. Usually when you're generating that much water, you have injection wells and you put it right back into the aquifer. So understanding where we should pull from, where should we inject to, or re-inject that water, those are some of the questions that would be answered from these geochemistry and tracer studies that we also have proposed to the state. So we have a multi-pronged integrated approach. If you remember the conceptual model that showed the chromium flowing from where the source was put in above the wetlands down to the Betos zone and then into the regional aquifer, we think the first place we ought to put focus is in our wetlands, and that's stabilize the wetlands so that none of that chrome can become mobile again that's locked up in the wetlands. So we're building a grade control structure in the wetlands that will keep those contaminants from moving, and that combined with reducing the amount of effluent that's being pumped into the canyon, we think that'll control the tail end of this plume. We're also looking at the Betos zone, if we want to do something on the tail end of the Betos zone to fix the contamination, and that combined with the pumping test that we're doing this summer, we think is going to kind of zero in on all aspects of where we should be attacking this plume. So this summer we want to pump on the 2 center wells here, R42 and R28, and like I say, start late June, mid to late June, pump those, treat the water, and land apply the water. We've got an area that we can sprinkle the water on either through a large irrigation system or using trucks with water applicators spraying out, so we'll have a green spot in the canyon down there. We're allowed to do that. We've got a discharge permit. We're allowed to do that until the ground freezes. So we'll go ahead and remove that chrome. We'll land apply it. We'll also be, during that time, we'll be collecting data to evaluate what I talked about earlier. Where's the optimum place to put a full-scale pumping unit? We need to understand all the properties of that aquifer to make sure that we're not just pumping water, we're pumping contaminant, we're pumping chrome. And like I say, where we need to inject that water if it can't be reused. So that work plan is currently at the state being reviewed. So I think comments were due back by the end of this month, end of May.
Treat the water before you.
Yeah, we run the water through ion exchange columns, remove the chromium, and then it comes out super clean, and we can just apply it and irrigate pretty much. So we're going to initiate this interim measure this summer. We're going to conduct the test through the fall until it freezes. What we'd like to do is get some additional data next summer that would support optimizing locations of wells and understanding the aquifer, and then submit a report to the Environment Department in 2014 that would allow us to go to the next step that would be a corrective measure evaluation. And then we'd be able to choose what the final remedy was or will be to get to a full-scale solution. Yes?
What about well R50? After you pump out of these two wells, will you look in R50 to see if there's a difference? Or you're not going to use R50 for a test pump situation also?
So there's some things we want to learn about the aquifer. And one of them is, if you pump, you're going to have an area of influence that you're drawing water from. And because of the location of R50, right on the border with San Ildefonso, we want to look at pumping that, or if it's the best place to pump. What we don't want to do is pull contamination towards the border. So that's part of what Danny's crew is looking at is, can we just gather enough information from those two wells to optimize going to the next size well, which is really a big pumping well. And where do you put that? Do you put it up here and draw the contamination from here back towards the laboratory? But right now, I don't think we want to start pumping from R50 and start pulling contamination closer to San Ildefonso border.
Okay, and I'm ignorant of distances and effects, but would the pumping from R42 and R28 change the nature of the water that you would find in R50 after a summer of pumping?
That's part of what the study is we want to see how far out it is influenced. But that's so far away that we aren't expecting to see anything.
Is that a possibility or is that radical?
It's certainly a possibility. I mean, one of the things is we go into these things open to learn what we want to learn, but maybe to just add a little bit on what Dave is saying is that the pumping at 42 and 28, all the wells that you see surrounding that area are going to be very actively monitored during this whole period. And they're going to be monitored for responses in water level. And that's really mostly what we're looking for, because the way they each respond is going to tell us about whether that whole area is uniform or whether there's sort of preferential flow paths that might exist. So it's going to tell us a lot about sort of the structure, if you will, of the plume area. And so that's kind of one really important thing. And we'll be monitoring concentrations in those, not as frequently as water levels, but quarterly. We really don't anticipate to see changes in contaminant concentration, but we do expect to see the water levels change. And by change, I'm talking about a few inches, that it really tells us about how pressures that are caused by pumping move out into the area and how each well responds differently. There may be really interesting shapes that are preferential ways that water moves. So that's what we'll be watching for. But we really don't expect for this scale of tests to be changing the concentrations in any of those perimeter wells.
Okay, and those two wells, are they at exactly the same depth, and all those wells around them, are they at exactly the same depth, or is there a wide variety of depths?
There are a wide variety for the most part. The vast majority of them are in the upper 70 feet or so.
Okay.
There are also different well sizes out there, correct?
A little bit different sizes, different stream lengths.
A few questions. How deep is the plume from the surface to the ground down? Or does it start from the surface?
1,000
It's
feet.
about 900 feet on average.
Okay. How long does it take for surface water to get down to that level?
That's actually something that we've been trying to put our arms around. As best we can tell, we've constrained it to somewhere between maybe 10 years, we think, at the fastest, and possibly 20 or 30 years total travel time from the canyon bottom down 900 feet to the regional groundwater.
Okay, so you're talking about pumping the water out, treating it, or cleaning that water, and
Mhm.
injecting it back into the ground?
No, what Dave was talking about was land applying it kind of in a sprinkler system. That water will never see the groundwater again. That's going to be used by plants and transpired and evaporated. So the land application is just a permitted way to get rid of relatively small volumes of water. This isn't water that will be viewed in any way as reinjection. When you get into the big scale pumping, like Dave was talking about, a 50 million gallons per year kind of scale, reinjection is one way that sometimes those types of waters are dispositioned. We don't know yet whether or not that's the way we'll ultimately disposition water.
Okay, but if you do reinject it, you're reinjecting it back into a contaminated supply of water that you're going to pump back up.
When you re-inject, there's two ways that can be beneficial. One is it's a good way to get rid of water, especially in a place where water is so precious. But you can actually use re-injection as a strategy to help manage the plume. In fact, you could potentially put re-injection wells in the down gradient side and sort of create a high spot that stops water from flowing in that direction, and kind of creating like a groundwater basin, if you will, to draw your water towards pumping wells. Or you might even re-inject it on the up gradient part of the plume to push it to your pumping wells faster. So re-injection has a couple of real strategic aspects to it. One is can you re-inject without creating a problem? You have to understand that. But you can also use it to strategically kind of influence the hydrology to benefit the pumping project.
But do you still not have contamination in the ground between the...
That's a good question. You might, and if you re-inject it into that pathway, you might intentionally want to get it into the groundwater where you can get at it faster, would be an option, or you might want to avoid one of those areas. And all those are things that we haven't really been able to get into those details yet. This first step that Dave's describing is really just figuring out whether or not pumping is a viable part of kind of that integrated solution that we were talking about.
Say, Danny?
Yeah.
Which one? Yeah, this one.
Is that the one you're permitted to use?
Yeah. Down in Albuquerque at Kirtland, the Air Force keeps maintaining that those all that jet fuel that went down, because it's in a kind of a remote area, it's not really going to ever hurt anyone. And I can understand it, even I can see that. So in this case, because it's kind of in the remote part of Los Alamos and remote part of the Pueblo, what would it hurt to just let it keep going till it goes forever?
That's a good question. I don't think we're, David, you can jump in here too. I don't think we're really sort of looking at it from that perspective right now. We kind of view at this point that groundwater anywhere is something worth protecting, basically. Not to mention that the consent order that we work under views groundwater as sort of a point of compliance, if you will. It doesn't look at a place where it might ultimately be pumped out, but it views all groundwater as a valid resource worth protecting. And that's the viewpoint we have as well. So we're really about trying to get in there and deal with the situation. That said, no remediation for a project like this can ever be expected to get 100% of it out of the ground. That's just impracticable. So part of this kind of approach that we're looking at is pumping and treating the water part of the approach. And what we'll be doing as part of that is figuring out how much of it can readily be pumped out and readily managed. But we need to understand, Dave talked about kind of some other parts of this interim measures, including some geochemistry studies and some tracer studies. Those are real important for us in understanding if there is some residual left behind, how much of that residual can we sort of safely leave behind, and what would be our prediction, I guess, if you will, for how that residual part will continue to sort of behave in the environment over time. So that's kind of that's exactly where we're at right now, is trying to understand all that so we can say, well, we can get our arms around this amount and get it out quickly, and this residual amount that you would end up spending 40 years and who knows how much money, we can let that kind of play out in part because it's remote, it's not going to impact a water supply well. But we have the variables of understanding how that is going to behave, how San Ildefonso will ultimately feel about contamination moving under those. That's exactly where we're at right now, is trying to understand what exactly is that remedy ultimately going to look like.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I had a question. Is this plume too deep to consider injecting any kind of a reductant in to try to stabilize it as Chrome 3?
No,
rather than Chrome
that's
6?
actually an excellent idea, and that's going to be part of our evaluation, is in situ reductants. There's natural microbes in the formation that like eating on chromium. They're not necessarily particularly populous, but what you can do is feed them sometimes, and you can actually get stimulation of microbial populations and let them do the work. So you can inject reductants, you can enhance the natural microbial population. Challenges with that are getting enough of coverage so that you're not just cleaning up little holes. And so injection wells are critical for that. And if you're injecting molasses, for instance, to stimulate microbes, it's hard to get molasses to connect between holes. So you have to evaluate whether it's worth putting 50 holes in the ground and injecting the stuff. Those are exactly the place we're at in terms of understanding what is that multi-pronged, what are all the elements of that multi-pronged approach. But you tackle a problem like this from as many fronts as you possibly can, and that's where we'll be going with this corrective measures project. Either way, go ahead.
And when you have the water pumped out, is the plan for treating it through the wetlands that would reduce it, or are you still unsure what you would do with it once you pump it up?
No, it's a very simple treatment. You can run them through an ion exchange column that will just strip the chromium right from the water. Then we would, from those ion exchange columns, it would flow into a holding pond where we would sample to make sure that we did have successful treatment. And then from those ponds, we would put it in the trucks and land apply. So I think the ion exchange would be used regardless of what scale we were executing, either these pilot and study wells or the full-scale 50 million gallons a year scale. Alex?
You mentioned that the sandy wetlands were effective at converting the Chrome 6 to Chrome 3. What are the concentrations at the surface of Chrome 6?
Do we see
Of Chrome 6,
the
Alex?
wetlands?
It looks like background for the most part. We've measured up to like 13 parts per billion Chrome 6 coming out of the wetland, and we think probably half of that was just tiny colloids that were carrying chromium. So once we took that out, we saw concentrations that looked just like background. So we think the Chrome 6 in the surface waters and shallow alluvial groundwaters is negligible at this point. Bob?
When Stephen mentioned that, why don't you just reduce it, especially if you're going to pump it out, there's a lot of reductants that will just drop it right out. But I tried that myself, and there was sodium bisulfite, sulfur dioxide, on and on and on, and it irreversibly reduced the chromium. But I wasn't working at the level that you're down at a lower elevation than I had to go to.
Right.
So that might be more difficult, but it certainly works.
Sure. We definitely know that we can do all the reduction we need to at the surface once you get water up to the surface. There's no question about it. The challenge is how do you do that down 900 feet into sort of in a black box, if you will. You have to be able to understand your hydrology and your aquifer well enough to know that when you do it, when you inject a reductant into the ground, it's going to penetrate as far as you want it to, and that it's going to do the work. And also without clogging up the pores in the formation and creating new problems for you. So there's a number of challenges. The concept is there, and we're aware of it. And a lot of the work we're going to be doing this year is going to help us know how feasible that is as part of the remedy. But we definitely appreciate your observations on that. We're aware of that, and we're also aware of the mixed successes that have been tried around the DOE complex and in industry with trying to do that. And the mixed success isn't about reduction, it's about the hydrology at the end of the day, for the most part. It's how well does the hydrology support that approach.
So we did vapor extractions at our level. It was only about 20 or 30 feet. And then after we vapor extracted, we then injected a gas and reductant. And that's the way we were able to
It's interesting.
assure that we would get it in.
We may want to talk to you about that at some point.
So part of the regulatory process is to look at all of these options, evaluate all options that can be used to remediate this, whether it's in situ or pumping, remediate the plume. And what we're hoping to do is that these few studies that we want to do this summer and early next year would answer some of the questions that would come up in that correct-to-measure evaluation. And so it'll be answering everything from, do you pump and treat the whole thing? Do you look for some sort of a natural attenuation on part of it and treat the other? And that ultimately becomes the state's NMED's decision with public input on what the path forward would be on this cleanup.
What's happening around the DOE complex? Because this is a technology that they've been working on for a long time.
Well, we actually had a team of experts from around the DOE complex come and visit Los Alamos and look at the data that we had and make recommendations to us. So they recommended this multi-pronged approach of you can't just look at pumping and treating and think you're going to turn on a pump and treat system for 20 years and you're going to fix it. Looking at in situ treatment, looking at making sure the stuff stays stable in the wetlands, interrupting the pathway for migration, reaching the aquifer. There were several, what am I leaving out, Danny? Several, every expert had their own opinion and some collaborative opinions on how we ought to deal with this. But I think understanding what we're going to do and what effects that super clean water is going to have if it's re-injected is going to have on the aquifer, and understanding everything about this before we flip the switch and turn it on is one thing we feel very strongly about, that you need to understand what the effects are and what your opportunities are before you, like say, throw that switch. Okay. And we'd be happy to come back periodically as our studies progress and status you, if you'd like to have us do that.
One thing on the briefing that we had intended is the one that you have in your package. The slides up here were a little bit, we have done some updates on this to make it more understandable. We'll make sure that you get also the slides that are here, so if there's any question on what Dave showed, you'll have a copy of that also.
But I think you have I brought down the right version, and it was just the old version was on the.
So Jeff, if you or Dave or Danny would send me the revised version, we'll put that up on our
I think
website.
it's actually my mistake. If you got something from Tammy today, I want to take responsibility for it.
Well, she called me this morning, but she didn't send it,
Okay.
or at least not that we know of.
Okay, that's why. Did I retract my...
I saw her email, so maybe it just didn't make it, but she sent it about
To William.
11 o'clock.
To William Alexander,
Yeah.
my staff, because I was on the tour.
Yeah, it was
But
William.
William was waiting for it, and he didn't get it.
Okay.
So.
I'm worried sometimes those files get so big.
Yeah, it could have been that.
I know she was having trouble with it bouncing back
But
a
we'll
couple
get
times.
the revised one up on our website.
Thank you.
Dave, did I hear you say that the plum is not moving?
No, you didn't hear me say that. We don't know. Danny, I mean, we know concentrations are fluctuating, whether that relates to movement or not. I think,
So we don't know if it's moving or not?
So I think that's a fair statement to say. We're not entirely sure. I mean, groundwater moves in the area. Chromium doesn't move quite as fast as groundwater, but it also is going to be a function of concentration and mixing with non-contaminated groundwater. So I like to use sort of an analogy of, I remember sort of seeing a little stream flow in the curb and maybe dropping a little red eyedropper into it, and if you drop it at a certain rate, the area that it's red kind of stays in one place, and you drop it faster and it can grow, and you drop it slower and it gets smaller. It could be that the rate of groundwater flow under this area and the amount of chromium that might still be dripping into the aquifer is in balance, and that variations you see are just associated with the fact that that balance hasn't been uniform for decades. It varies. And so wells can show change over time. If you want to, maybe go to one of the slides, that well R50 that sits kind of at the edge of the plume, right near the San Ildefonso boundary. I can point to it from here. I have one of these. Yeah, two of us, right there. That well actually changed from 50 parts per billion when we first drilled it to nearly 100. So that looks like a change. There are other wells all through the plume. Our R42 has ranged from, I think, as little as 800 to as much as over 1,200 over time, and then back down again. I was just looking at some data the other day from R11 right here, and it increased by almost 3 times over about a 2-year period. The same period that we watched R50 change from 50 to 100, it increased by almost 3 times and then dropped back down to the same level again. So it makes it a little bit difficult to understand, believe it or not, in the sense of how a lot of people view studies on plumes like this. We have a relatively short period of record to be able to answer some of those questions. Some of these wells like R50 and R61 are only a couple of years old. And so the kind of variability we see in those wells, I mean, just as hydrogeologists, we look at that and we say there's a number of reasons you could see variability there. One could be that the plume is expanding. Another could be that it's just variations in concentrations within the plume. Even though it's highest right here and generally decreases, it doesn't mean it's this perfectly uniform decrease. So I apologize that we can't give you something that feels like, yes, it's expanding, or no, it's not. It's just that we don't have the data that lets us feel at this point that I can tell you definitively what it's doing. We're not taking the position that if it's not migrating, therefore we don't need to do anything about it. It's still time to go do something about it.
So it looks like it's knocking on the door of our friends. Have they started to scream yet?
well,
We have engaged San Ildefonso.
Yeah, Ellison?
I swear, I normally do not drive around with a map of LANL's wells in my back seat, but my office is relocating today and I had to strip down everything. But this map shows a slightly different shaped plume. I wondered if, it gives good context, but I didn't know if it was still accurate. It's about a year old. Can I show it to you, Danny, and see if it's worth sharing?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And so there's a couple of things. Oh, I can already see that you are, those aren't plumes.
These are research areas?
Those are, yeah, what else is showing here. We have, Dave talked about quarterly reports that we've been doing on these wells. We have a large integrated groundwater monitoring program that includes monitoring of what we've chosen, for no better term, monitoring groups. So it's groups of wells that are each designed to address a very specific set of monitoring questions.
Danny, why don't you stand over next to the door there so everybody can see?
On the other side of the door?
Yeah.
Depending on how big the plume is, we can watch on the other side of the door. So what Alison is referring to are these areas. And actually, it's a great comment, because we've actually changed the way this is illustrated in our new report, because it looks like plumes. What these areas highlighted here, they're what we call monitoring groups. They're simply groups of wells that are each designed to answer specific questions. The chromium monitoring group is this one right here. This just means this is the entire area where we feel that we've got to do monitoring in one way or another to be able to answer the questions and the issues that we're talking about here. So we got several comments that these look like plumes, so we've actually changed that. Absolutely, sure.
So the 20 wells that I said gets monitored to support chromium is in that chromium group there.
Nana?
Is the aquifer that has the chromium plume the one that goes into the same area as the Buckman wells, or does it go below?
We think, from the evidence that we've seen, we think that there's no interaction between this aquifer and the Buckman well field.
So it's one that's somehow geologically separate?
Yes. That doesn't stop us from continuing to monitor in the Buckman well field, though, just to be sure.
Hey, Danny, is that based on elevation?
No, it's actually based on, to kind of answer a question like that, you sort of have to look at as many lines of evidence as you possibly can. And we've been looking at how, when you pump on wells, you create a pressure, basically, out into the formation. And we do a lot of work monitoring how pressures are from pumping wells are felt at different monitoring wells. So that's one way. We don't see connection in pressures. Even within the Buckman well field, sometimes there's wells that are almost a stone's throw apart from each other that don't feel the pressures from each other because of, in some cases, probably faults that separate the two. But other things are looking at sort of what you could consider to be sort of a geochemistry fingerprint, if you will. So you can kind of look at water that comes out of the Buckman well field and look at sort of naturally occurring components of that water and compare it to the same components in water that's underneath the laboratory, and you look at the two, and it's just not the same water. You look at groundwater ages, they're very different. There's kind of a variety of lines of evidence that we've looked at, and our conclusion is that the likelihood of mixing between the two is very, very low. Again, that said, we understand the obligation to continue to verify that with quarterly monitoring in the well field, and we do that. Probably one other maybe obvious but worthwhile point to make is we're still talking many, many miles, and the likelihood that after, and as part of all the remedies that we do on this plume, that this could ever become an issue in the Buckman well field is in fact negligible. There's no way we would let, or NMED frankly, would let the plume get so far afield that it would ever become a threat to a well field that far away. I mean, we're going to tackle this thing as much as we can right in the footprint that it's in now and not let it become a problem.
Thank you, Danny. Dave, thank you. Thank you. Next up, we have Jeff.